Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The head of the monster of the French Revolution. Throughout the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, thousands of people lost their heads on the execution device known as the guillotine. It was a quick and efficient method of killing, which would be passed by King Louis XVI. However, interestingly, he would also lose his head on the very device that he oversaw the creation of. In fact, some sources claim that the king himself suggested using the slanted blade, which would take so many heads clean off. But this video isn't necessarily about a man who lost his head on the guillotine. His murderer, a woman, would be the one to lose hers. However, what happened to Jean Paul Marat's remains following his death was subjected to a strange ordeal, in which Madame Tussaud cast a haunting figure of the murdered French journalist and politician. But what is the story of the head of the man stabbed by a female French angel? It was Charlotte Corday who on the 13th of July 1793 would assassinate the Jacobin leader Jean Paul Marat. She was a woman from a slightly aristocratic family in Normandy and was from Caen. She was a sympathiser of the Girondins, and at the time of the Revolution she believed that Jean Paul Marat, who was an outspoken politician and journalist, was responsible for the revolution becoming more brutal with its treatment of civilians. The Reign of Terror that emerged across the nation was brutal, and thousands of people were going to the guillotine. Every day heads were being taken off inside of French towns and cities, and even those who it was suspected harboured a slight anti-revolutionary sentiment were executed. There was one story that emerged from a French city in which a wife witnessed her husband lose his head on the guillotine, and as she shed a tear for her loved one, she was then accused of also being an enemy of the revolution, and for this she was also brought to the execution device and lost her head minutes later. But Corday would travel to Paris armed with a 6-inch knife, and she would try to gain access to Marat's home. She did initially plan to assassinate him in front of the entire National Convention, but he had been suffering with a skin disorder and was at home recovering. She went to his house at noon on the 13th of July 1793, and she would try to gain access to Marat's home. She was to begin with turned away, but then she returned that evening with an excuse that she knew about a Girondist uprising in Caen, and then Marat would allow her into his home. He was conducting meetings from his bath because of the skin condition, and Corday gave him the information she had, and then as he wrote down the names of the plotters, Corday pulled out the knife and stabbed him in the chest, and Marat screamed, "Help me, my dear friend," before he then died. Charlotte Corday would voice her reasons for murdering Marat in a letter she wrote to her father and said, "Forgive me, my dear papa, for having disposed of my existence without your permission. I have avenged many innocent victims. I have prevented many other disasters. The people, one day delusioned, will rejoice in being delivered from a tyrant. If I tried to persuade you that I was passing through England, it was because I hoped to keep it incognito. But I recognised the impossibility. I hope you will not be tormented. In any case, I believe that you would have defenders in Caen. I took Gustave Dolciet as a defender. Such an attack allows no defence. It is for the form. Goodbye, my dear papa. Please forget me, or rather rejoice in my fate. The cause is good. I kiss my sister whom I love with all my heart, as well as my parents. Do not forget this verse by Corneille. Crime is shame, not the scaffold. It is tomorrow at 8 o'clock that I am judged, this 16 July. As mentioned, she would go to the guillotine for her death, and many considered her to have been a martyr, and someone who killed for the greater good, as many across France regarded Marat as a monster who was advocating the slaughter of many. But following Marat's death, his remains were subjected to a strange ordeal. Madame Tussaud, following Marat's death, was under orders to cast a death mask, or death mould of Marat's face, which was common at the time, with high-profile politicians having this sort of thing done to them after death. One quote states that Madame Tussaud was fetched by some gens d'armes who took her to the house of Marat just after he had been killed by Charlotte Corday, for the purpose of taking a cast from his face. He was still warm, and his bleeding body and the cadaverous aspect of his almost diabolical features presented a picture replete with horror, and Madame Tussaud performed her task under the influence of the most painful emotions. It was by David's orders that Madame Tussaud took a cast from the face of Marat, as also of Charlotte Corday after death, from which David made a splendid picture of the scene of the monster's assassination, and had written upon it, David A. Marat, for whom he pretended an extraordinary friendship. But this would state that she was collected in secret by members of the guard who wanted to preserve a relic of Marat. The body of Marat was allegedly transferred to a bedroom next door, where the certification of death took place, and the corpse would still be there the next afternoon when the autopsy was carried out. So it would have been at this time when the death mask of Marat was cast. There was a lot of anger surrounding his death, and it's believed that Tussaud would also later take a cast of Charlotte Corday's head, the woman that murdered Marat after she lost her head on the guillotine. But the surviving death masks of Jean Paul Marat are haunting, and they show him in his final moments with his mouth open in the pain of death following being stabbed. It's very haunting, and his gazing look is incredibly morose and scary. There are other death masks that were allegedly created of Marat, including ones inside of French museums that show his head, and some of these are even slightly creepy, with Marat's face being contorted with pain and his mouth open. There has been some suggestion that the Madame Tussaud collaborated with an artist, David, on the model of his head, and it was said by one historian that Marie always claimed that David used her wax model of Marat when he painted his own version of events. This is one of the claims in Madame Tussaud's memoirs that is probably accurate. The day after the assassination, the convention ordered David to paint the scene of Marat's death as part of the public mourning for a hero of the revolution. It was a hot July and, although David went to work immediately, wrapping most of the body in wet cloth to delay putrefaction, the corpse rotted so fast that it had to be interred on the 16th of July. The bathtub murder scene, one of the most famous images of the revolution, may have been reconstructed by David in the summer and autumn of 1793 from the wax tableau already on display in Curtis's salon. Hence it is no coincidence that Marat Assassiné, presented by David to the convention on the 14th of October 1793, has a strong resemblance to a wax model rather than a cadaver. There were some suggestions also that Madame Tussaud may have even worked based off of the work of David to create the head of Marat, but others claim that it was Tussaud's work that influenced paintings, and others then made their work based off of this. One historian states that palpable wounds were, by contrast, what Tussaud specialised in. The attraction of her waxworks depended on a kind of forensic gaze. David deploys a familiar aesthetics of martyrdom, where the violated body is intended to move the viewer to the contemplation of immaterial values. Madame Tussaud's adjoining room, later the Chamber of Horrors, instead concentrated on bringing death itself close in all its abject details. In the Chamber of the Dead, the illusion of life never brings the dead back to life. On the contrary, one could say of Madame Tussaud that she brings the dead back to death. It's believed that the Marat death mask cast by Madame Tussaud was then made with the heads and shoulders and was shipped to London in 1802, and the shoulders and head were used to mould further waxworks, but the scene of Marat in the bathtub was used as a shocking advertisement for the exhibition that would be shown. But what was created was with regards to Jean Paul Marat's death mask was completely haunting, and further waxworks depicted the scene of Marat being stabbed with the knife left in his chest. Charlotte Corday, when she carried out his assassination, wanted to rid France of a man she regarded as a monster, but the death mask is incredibly haunting and scary and shows Marat in his final moments. Charlotte Corday's head would go on a shocking journey itself, in the following centuries, as it would pass through many people's hands who wanted to show it off. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.